The UAE Ministry of Finance AEOI portal also allows for reporting financial institutions that are sponsoring entities with sponsored entities under it to register for FATCA purposes. In today's session, we will go through the registration of a sponsoring entity, followed by the sponsored entities that are within that registration. So we'll go to the portal and click on New User and start with the checker registration for the sponsoring entity. This follows a similar format to the single FI registration where a checker user is required to register first, get approval from the RA, and then is able to create subsequent maker users. We land on the background to the FATCA and CRS regimes, which also has instructions for the legal entity classification and user registration. You're required to read through these instructions and then continue with the registration process. Under registration type, for the purposes of this video, we will be choosing the sponsoring entity, which is relevant for FATCA purposes only. Choose the JIN. You're required to put in your JIN that you have obtained from the IRS as a sponsoring entity for FATCA purposes. As a sponsoring entity under FATCA, you are required to have an SP JIN, which indicates that you are a sponsoring entity. In this case, data not found indicates that this JIN has not been previously used to register an RFI, and therefore we can continue with our registration. For demonstration purposes, we would be using some dummy data to register as a sponsoring entity on the AEOI portal. Required to choose your identifier and enter the unique number that is present on your documentation. Please choose your licensing authority, which should be aligned with your regulatory authority. In this case, for example, if my entity is licensed by the Abu Dhabi Global Market, ADGM, my relevant regulatory authority should be Abu Dhabi Global Market. For purposes of this video, we are using a UAE entity to register. You're then required as a sponsoring entity to classify your FATCA classification. Your JIN will be pre-populated, and you are required to enter the additional details that are relevant for the registration. Once all the mandatory fields have been filled out, this gray button appears where you are able to click on it and add yourself as a sponsoring entity for registration purposes. Under the same page, I will then move forward to enter my sponsored entity that I will register under my same registration. In this case, I will enter the JIN for the sponsored entity. There are specific JIN values that are required to be used for the sponsored entity registration. One of these values that is allowed by the system is SF. Other JIN values that are allowed to be used are SS, SD, and SL. Once again, data is not found here. Please add complete information. Because this entity has not previously been registered, we will then continue to add in all the mandatory requirements, including the email ID, address, and number for my entity. Once again, I am required to provide all the information necessary to complete the registration of the sponsored entity. where I choose my licensing authority and enter the relevant details. I'm then able to choose my regulatory authority, where you are not regulated by any of these four: central bank, ADGM, the DIFC, or the ESCA. You're required to choose NA during your registration. Please provide your sponsored entity's FATCA classification and fill out the relevant details needed to complete registration. Once the mandatory fields have been filled out, I am then able to add this as a sponsored entity under my sponsoring entity registration and move forward. You are required to add in your role or title at the entity. In this case, we're choosing the checker account as this is the first registration for the RFI user. You also have the option to add additional RAs in the situation where you are regulated by multiple regulatory authorities in the UAE. You're required to upload the relevant documentation for both the sponsored and the sponsoring entity in order to be able to move forward with your registration. This is a requirement to be able to move forward. Okay, I think. Set your password for your account and enter the security question and details in order to move forward. Once your registration is complete, the notification will be sent to the RA to approve your account. Once your account is approved, you will receive a mail notification that your account has been approved, subsequent to which you are able to go into your profile and create maker users, which you are then able to approve for future filings and submitting the risk assessment by the reporting deadline.